This is Rena Borcateria, Director of the DDCSP Collaborative, and in this video I'll be talking to you about supportive workplaces, challenges and best practices on inclusion strategies. These are students from the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program, specifically from the DDCSP Collaborative run by the University of Florida. And these students are the reason that despite the fact that I run an undergraduate training program for students that are interested in increasing diversity in the field of conservation, I've also turned my attention to making workplaces more inviting to people of color and others from underrepresented groups. So our students and anyone who's commonly excluded from conservation spaces will have a real chance to be successful and move into leadership positions, which at its heart is the mission of our program. So I've done a lot of work over the past 2 years to understand the barriers to retention our students will face in graduate school and the workplace. And I'm using this knowledge both to support our students as they enter these spaces and to change the settings and culture in which they are likely to find themselves. And there are many reasons to be concerned about this. The Green 2.0 report pointed out that our environmental agencies and organizations aren't doing very well at hiring people of color into paid positions or in moving them up the career ladder into leadership positions. There appear to be bottlenecks in hiring and in retention that keep us from becoming and remaining more diverse. Our best efforts in diversity and inclusion have not been very effective to date. Now, the more I've learned about working around diversity and inclusion, the more I've appreciated being able to put these issues into their historical context. So just to give you a brief background, the concept of diversity and inclusion in employment was born during the civil rights era of the 1960s, with the establishment of things like the President's Commission on Equal Opportunity in 1961 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Then in 1971, President Nixon started requiring federal contractors to start practicing affirmative action. This meant that employers had to take proactive measures to meet diversity goals and timetables. These are what came to be known as quotas and led to some of the first charges of reverse discrimination. The affirmative action approach was ineffective at leveling the playing field and creating a truly diverse and inclusive society for a number of reasons. First of all, for some people, it challenged the ideal of the U.S. as a meritocracy because whites saw this as giving undeserved benefits to people of color without realizing themselves the white privilege that had allowed them their own positions. Secondly, it did little to change the atmosphere or climate. Placing the focus on race and gender still emphasized differences in a way that was divisive. It was a zero-sum game, us versus them. Diversity programs were viewed as being for others or blacks or the less qualified. People of color and women often felt unwelcome and still faced bias and discrimination on the job. They were not viewed as a business asset, let alone a business imperative. We still see both positive and negative effects of these programs lingering in our organizations today. The unidimensional framework of most diversity efforts around race, ethnicity, gender, and other characteristics is still prevalent. And this has caused many white men to feel disconnected from diversity efforts, as they may see themselves as the only group excluded by these programs, don't understand the what, why, and how of diversity efforts, and remain uninvolved or passive about diversity. In some instances, they might even be openly resistant to it. So while we do have somewhat more diverse workplaces, they have certainly not kept up with the pace of change in U.S. society, and there's still resentment and a zero-sum attitude around diversity. And how does this influence our workplaces and best practices for retention? Well, I'm going to show you a very simplified example of how that disconnect might influence workplace atmospheres that can negatively impact retention of people of color or from other underrepresented groups. Now let's say you have a bunch of students that have just graduated and have started looking for jobs. And Joe here works for the Fish and Wildlife Service and has an opening for a waterfowl biologist who can also do some population modeling. This is a rare opportunity for some lucky graduate to get a job with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But as you can see, we have a wide gulf separating Joe from his potential applicant pool that Joe will have to figure out how to bridge to find the right person. Meanwhile, Helen over here recently finished her thesis on population dynamics and habitat use of fulvous whistling ducks in Florida. She would be perfect for the job if only Joe had some way of reaching out to her. Joe really wants to find the best person for the job, but he knows that everybody's pushing this whole diversity thing. To him, the choice is between the best person or the diversity hire. His implicit assumption is that the best person for the job will not be a person of color. And because he doesn't feel very inclined to go out of his way for the diversity hire, he just kind of does what he always does, and he lets the chips fall where they may. So in addition to posting the job on USA Jobs, he reaches out to his old graduate school buddy, Bill, who sends the announcement on to the graduates from his lab. And they send it on to their friends. Meanwhile, we have Marcy down here, who's living with her parents until she finds a job and spends her day scouring USA Jobs and other job boards. And 3 of our potential applicants, who are people of color and don't have access to these networks and aren't signed up for the right USA Jobs search terms, don't hear about the job, and so they're lost from the applicant pool. And this includes Helen, who would have been the perfect person for the job. Since no one who's applied is perfect, and all seem more or less equally trainable, he picks the diversity applicant to meet his office's recruiting goals. In reality, studies have shown that if there's only one representative from an outside group, they're less likely to be hired than if they were one of multiple people from that same group. Meanwhile, Joe doesn't have a lot of faith in the hire, and Jason worries that he was only selected for the color of his skin. And while his new coworkers are outwardly welcoming, on the inside they're seething with resentment or else bummed out that their job will be made harder, making up for the new hire's deficiencies. These feelings may further impede diversity efforts and perpetuate perceptions of reverse discrimination, or that people of color aren't really qualified for the positions that they're hired for. And why haven't subsequent developments in our understanding of diversity and inclusion and the proliferation of training programs designed to create more tolerant workplaces done away with these attitudes? Well, in the 1980s, the corporate world started to realize some of the financial benefits of diversity, and they started taking diversity initiatives more seriously. While EEO training was primarily focused on preventing lawsuits, newer forms of diversity training began to focus more on encounter groups or other forms of sensitivity training that were supposed to help people understand one another better and therefore work together more easily. Now, it's my experience that people I've worked with have found the EEO-type trainings to be pretty boring and to take time away from other more important work that they need to be doing. And you can see how this would not pave the ground for greater inclusivity in the workplace and tends to build greater resistance. Furthermore, it's not been very effective in changing workplace cultures. Then there are the workshops focused on helping people become more sensitive to the feelings and experiences of people of color and other minorities. These are often multi-day workshops where people are asked to delve deeply into their biases and prejudices and to share experiences as the oppressor or the oppressed. Now, this is not my personal opinion, but it seems like about half of our electorate is in agreement with Grumpy Cat here. In my opinion, this type of training is valuable at the individual level, but only if the individual is ready and really wants to do this work. And again, this type of training hasn't been successful at changing workplace cultures around diversity and inclusion. Okay, so the 2 most frequently used forms of training don't seem to be very effective at changing workplace cultures. But really, what sorts of motivation are they offering to employees? Are they supposed to fear the repercussions of not being up to date on their required trainings? Are they supposed to feel motivated to value others and to spend time experiencing what it's like to walk in another culture's shoes when they fear that those shoes will be replacing their own in the near future? Well, there are many in the D&I movement, and I'm one, that believe that pragmatism and self-interest is the most effective way to motivate real and rapid change in our workplace and organizational cultures. And this means looking to the business case for diversity. Diversifying our workforces can bring more funding to our agencies and organizations, increase public engagement in conservation, and help us reach our conservation goals. At its core, the business case is focused on leveraging your most important access, your people. And while many members of the public don't seem to realize it, it's our employees, our public servants, that are the greatest assets of federal and state agencies. And this goes for NGOs as well. The business case also highlights the importance of enabling any individual to contribute to the organization's mission, and it ensures that all employees receive recognition for their contributions. It shows why all employees need to be engaged and how their engagement can be used to meet its commitments. And as the business case for diversity is made more clear, as its impact is measured in concrete terms, such as return on investment or ROI, people are incentivized to become more culturally competent and inclusive. So this isn't just some abstract idea, it's the business case for your organization using your financial metrics and HR data. So now let's talk a little more about actual best practices for an inclusive workplace. And actually, I think the very best practice is to see diversity as an asset and not a liability, and to change the culture so that people are motivated to appreciate programs that use a multi-dimensional framework to promote diversity and inclusion, and to acknowledge the many ways in which people differ in their identities, backgrounds, and beliefs. I also suggest using the influencer model of Joseph Grenny and his colleagues. I'm not going to go into it in detail here because that would be a whole other presentation. But basically, it involves analyzing a situation that you want to change and then determining how to make sure people have the motivation and ability to enact the desired change. This involves identifying vital behaviors or moments of disproportionate influence, where change in this behavior will have an outsized influence in advancing you towards your goals. For instance, recruiting might be a moment of disproportionate influence, both in the composition of your workforce and in your retention rates. For example, what if that situation I showed you earlier had played out just a little bit differently? So in addition to using his normal network, with a prominent diversity joint venture network or other diversity-oriented network, Joe would have known to send the job description there as well. And so the coordinator would have sent it on to the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Programs and other diversity training programs in their network, who would have sent it on to their alumni, and possibly even targeted it personally to Helen, who one of them might have remembered had done her thesis on fulvous whistling ducks. So now Joe's choice is clear. There's no denying the fact that Helen is the most qualified person for the job. And when her coworkers meet her, they truly are glad to see her because they know that she is qualified and that she'll help them reach their mission. And with each hire like this, I think that we'll find our workplaces becoming more and more inclusive. Now, because the influencer model requires you to clarify measurable results, best practices also include using the time, money, and talent that it requires to develop a strong business case for diversity for your organization. You have to tie diversity and inclusion inextricably to your organization's ability to accomplish its goals. But talking about best practices more specifically now, I think that when it comes to retaining younger people of color, you have a millennial challenge as much as you have a diversity challenge. In fact, I asked a few of our students to answer some questions for me related to careers in public service in general and in the federal government more specifically. One of the questions I asked was what factors would influence their decision on whether to work for the federal government, and here is one of their responses. One student said, "If the job is in the conservation field I desire, with a workable budget, good working conditions and terms, a reasonably sized team to carry out the task instead of relying on a couple individuals to carry out a large task, a team who models diversity or greatly welcomes diversity, and the job is working towards making a difference, then I would greatly consider working here." But what I think is cool about this quote is that the student is already savvy enough about the field to know what she's looking for and what some of the pitfalls may be. Then I took a look at some of the things that were most important to the students in deciding where to work. I split it up into demographically oriented questions and a second set of questions that I thought would resonate with them equally, if not more. And so you can see here at the bottom that the students weren't really focused on their own racial identity or ethnic group. They placed much more value on broadly inclusive and diverse workplaces, as shown by diverse employees and a welcoming environment. And when it comes to seeing themselves represented in the workplace, they were more interested in seeing people of their own generation than of their own race or ethnicity. But even more than issues related to diversity, they cared about their impact. They wanted to be fully heard, to have opportunities for professional advancement, and for their employer to be open to change. They wanted to be able to contribute meaningfully to their employer's mission, and most of all, they wanted to contribute meaningfully to society. The problem is that they're not exactly patient. Of the 5 students, 3 thought that they should be able to contribute meaningfully to their employer's mission immediately, while the other 2 were willing to wait for a whole 1 to 2 years. While I applaud their ambition, this can lead to discontent when we have a slow-moving bureaucracy and resistance to change. So to reiterate, what are the best practices? Link diversity and inclusion to your mission. Create workplaces that value diversity and strive for inclusion because they understand that diversity is an asset and that it has an effect on the bottom line. Make a strategic diversity plan and do the work to calculate your diversity and inclusion return on investment. Provide annual updates on the value of your D&I efforts in quantitative and monetized measures, along with qualitative analyses or summaries. Focus on millennial issues as much or more than race and gender, but avoid focusing on it in ways that focus on difference or on dispelling stereotypes, as these approaches can reinforce biases instead of eliminating them, as we've seen with race and gender. Instead of falling back on stereotypes about negative attributes that millennials may or may not exhibit, leverage the attributes that they do bring to the workplace. Could you have a mentoring program where older and younger folks could do some reciprocal mentoring, with the older folks maybe teaching the younger folks more about field biology or natural history, the things that are so often left out of basic conservation and ecology programs today, and have the younger folks help them out with technological challenges, such as social media or some of the newer statistical packages or methods. Some sort of program that is purely voluntary and where the relationship grows naturally out of a mutual give and take, where the younger employees feel like they have something to contribute. Studies have shown that it's not as important that a mentor be the same race as the mentee, as much as it is for the mentor to be committed to supporting them and facilitating their growth. During evaluations, do not hold back on giving feedback to people who are different from you in age, race, gender, or other form of difference. Sometimes managers are more honest in their feedback to people they relate to more easily, and while it may seem harsh initially, it lets them know that there's something they need to change, and they can follow up to figure out what that is and how to change it, and this will help them rise through the organization. They may be reluctant to provide honest feedback to people who are different from them because they may feel awkward, or they don't want to risk being misunderstood, or they fear being thought of as racist, sexist, or homophobic for criticizing them. But this does those employees a disservice because without knowing that they're actually falling short in some way, they won't even know that they need to change something, let alone know what needs to change. So they get stuck in these positions that they can't seem to advance from, and part of this may be due to a lack of honest feedback. So instead, supply feedback equally to your employees regardless of how well you relate to them. Couch your feedback in positive terms, avoid unhelpful negative comments, and provide helpful comments and suggestions for improvement. If you socialize with your employees, don't talk about work at the bar or on the golf course. The odds are high that if you do, you'll be privileging those that are closest to you and probably most like you with information that they can use to get ahead and which people who are different from you don't have access to. If you do talk about work, share the conversation with others when you get back to your workplace. And support them. Be kind to them. Remember that millennials are the most attached to their families of any of the modern generations. In the absence of their biological family and social networks, they may look to the people around them to act as family. So don't be shy with your praise. At least in the beginning, be very explicit about what needs to be done and how to do it. Remember that education these days is much more structured than for the older generations when they were in school, and that millennials may require structured instructions, at least in the beginning. One of the things we try to work on with our students in the DDCSP collaborative is becoming an independent thinker, especially when they're out doing field work, but also when it comes to creative problem solving and leadership. Be consistent and constructive with your feedback. Silence on your part may be seen as failure on theirs. And I'm not saying that you should ditch diversity training by any means. But for general or organization-wide diversity training, I would focus on training that emphasizes both EEOC and workplace rules, including an emphasis on what constitutes harassment and some of the subtle distinctions around micro-inequities and microaggressions. This is important for all groups to have an understanding of, as it affords some protection of the outgroups against harassment, makes clear what sorts of behaviors are unacceptable, and may help people choose what to address and what to let go. It's also important to have a clear harassment policy that clearly spells out the types of behaviors that will not be tolerated, strong encouragement to report harassment, and zero tolerance for violations. Be cautious about using off-the-shelf diversity training and workshops that haven't been adapted to the specific needs of your organization. As you build the business case for diversity and find key areas for improvement, you'll want these to be addressed in your training, and suggestions or skills need to be supplied for their improvement. Otherwise, employees may have a new awareness, but no new knowledge or skills that will help them change their workplace, and this can lead to frustration as they go back with no real way or concrete plan to change the workplace climate. But also, make cultural and sensitivity training available to anyone who wants it, because it's also very important. People just need to be willing and able to do that sort of work. Once they're in, make sure that people are compensated equally and have equal opportunities for advancement, regardless of whether they belong to an underrepresented or protected group. Put the focus on positive actions. Once they're in, make sure that people are compensated equally and have equal opportunities for advancement, regardless of whether they belong to an underrepresented or protected group or not. Put the focus on positive actions like the ones I mentioned before that can be taken to make the workplace more appealing to everyone. In my opinion, if you're looking for a wholesale change in culture, focus on inclusion rather than diversity. Focus on the changing times rather than millennials, older workers, women, and minorities. Now, there are lots of views on what best practices are, and mine primarily reflect the model employed by the Society for Diversity and the Institute for Diversity Certification. But from what I've learned from them, along with my experiences with the students in the DDCSP Collaborative, if you employ these practices with all of your employees, regardless of race or other minority status, I think you'll find that your workplaces will start to feel substantially more inclusive and retention will improve, with no spotlight placed on underrepresented groups that may lead to or maintain a divisive climate.